when Lisa refused to serve that veteran. She had no idea she was about to confront the most uncomfortable truth of her life, and the real owner of the restaurant. The hum of the old ceiling fan filled the air, blending with the clatter of dishes and snippets of conversation. It was an ordinary Thursday at Charlie's Grill, a modest-looking diner nestled in the heart of a small southern town. Things didn't change much there. The same regulars, the same jokes exchanged between waitresses, and the same sidelong glances cast at strangers who dared to walk through the door. Lisa Carter, a waitress, was behind the counter, wiping a glass with mechanical movements. Her blonde hair was tied in a bun, and her worn apron had become an unofficial uniform since she started working there 5 years ago. Lisa had a reputation in town, efficient, direct, but also a bit abrasive, especially with those who didn't fit her idea of what a respectable customer should be. The bell above the door jingled, and Lisa looked up. There he was, tall, dark-skinned, wearing a worn military jacket and a cap that read Vietnam Veteran. The man looked tired, as if he had traveled a long way to get there. He slowly approached the counter, while some of the regulars averted their gaze or whispered among themselves. Lisa observed him with a mixture of suspicion and coldness. When the man smiled politely and asked for a coffee, she crossed her arms, pretending not to have heard him. "Sorry, I can't serve you," Lisa said curtly, as if reciting a rule from some invisible handbook. The veteran, whose name was Thomas Harris, frowned but remained calm. He had faced situations like this for decades and had learned to keep his composure. "I just want a coffee, please," Thomas repeated, his voice steady but firm. Lisa let out an incredulous laugh. "Whatever you want, but not here. You should try somewhere else," she replied with a tone dripping with disdain. The restaurant fell silent. The few remaining customers pretended to focus on their plates, while Thomas stood his ground at the counter, unmoving. At the back of the diner, an older woman watched the scene with interest. She sat alone at a discreet table, her beige coat hanging from the back of her chair. This was Eleanor Whitman, a familiar figure in town, though few knew much about her. Always dressed modestly, Eleanor was the kind of person who stayed on the sidelines. But at that moment, something in her dark eyes sparkled with determination. "Excuse me, young man," Eleanor said loudly, addressing Thomas. "Why don't you sit with me? I could use some company." Thomas turned to her, surprised, then nodded with a grateful smile. Lisa, however, wasn't about to let the situation slide. She approached Eleanor's table with determined steps, leaning toward her with a warning tone. "Mrs. Whitman, I don't want any trouble here." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her demeanor unshaken. "Trouble?" she replied calmly. "The only trouble I see is that a customer is asking for a coffee, and your job is to serve it." Lisa pressed her lips together, but before she could retort, Eleanor said something that made the tension in the room skyrocket. "Although, I suppose I have the final say here. Don't I, Lisa? After all, this restaurant belongs to me." Lisa froze for a moment, as if she hadn't heard correctly. Her expression shifted from disbelief to a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Eleanor, with a serenity that bordered on authority, adjusted her posture in her chair and clasped her hands on the table. Thomas remained standing, watching cautiously, but now with a spark of curiosity in his eyes. "I'm saying that this restaurant, Lisa, belongs to me. I bought it over 2 decades ago, but I never felt the need to boast about it," Eleanor replied, taking a sip of her coffee. Then, with a faint smile, she added, "After all, you see more when people don't know who you are." Murmurs grew among the customers, and Lisa felt everyone's eyes on her. Her face turned red. I didn't know," she stammered awkwardly. "I always thought Charlie was the owner." Eleanor shook her head gently. "Charlie was my husband. He founded this place, but after his death, I kept it going. Of course, I let others handle the daily operations, but the name and the purpose of this place were always ours," she explained, pausing to meet Lisa's gaze. "And do you know what that purpose was?" Lisa shook her head, unable to answer. This restaurant was created to be a space where everyone felt welcome, regardless of their skin color, their accent, or how much money they had in their pocket. Eleanor said, her tone tinged with firmness. Charlie was a man of principles, and he wouldn't tolerate the kind of behavior you just showed here. Thomas cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence in the room. Look, Mrs. Whitman, I don't want to cause any trouble. I'm used to this sort of thing, he said calmly, though his tone hinted at the exhaustion he had carried for years. Eleanor turned to him with a kind but determined look. No, Mr. Harris, you're not the problem here. The problem is the blindness of those who refuse to see people for who they are and instead judge them for what they think they represent, she said, glancing at Lisa. Lisa felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know what to say. For years, she had worked there, thinking it was just another job, but now she realized she had been trampling on the values of those who had given her this opportunity. Eleanor sighed and stood up with a dignity that seemed to fill the entire room. Lisa, I appreciate your hard work all these years, but we need to make some changes here, she said firmly. Not just in how we treat our customers, but in how we represent this place. If you can't understand that, maybe this job isn't for you. Eleanor turned to Thomas with a warm smile. Please have a seat. Today the coffee is on the house. And if you're willing, I'd love to hear a bit of your story. Thomas smiled, touched by her kindness. He sat beside her and began sharing fragments of his life. His days in Vietnam, his return home, and the challenges he faced trying to reintegrate into a society that often treated him like a stranger. Lisa watched from the back of the restaurant, her thoughts churning. Each word from Thomas seemed to hit her harder. She had grown up in a bubble, surrounded by inherited beliefs she had never questioned. But now, listening to the man she had rejected, she began to see not just Thomas, but herself in a new light. When her shift ended that night, Lisa approached Eleanor, who was closing the register. I know I have a lot to learn, Lisa said, her voice trembling. But I want to try. I want to be better. Eleanor looked at her for a moment, then nodded. That's what I wanted to hear, she replied with a faint smile. We can all change, Lisa. We just need to be willing to try. From that day forward, things at Charlie's Grill began to change. Eleanor became more involved in managing the diner, ensuring that its original values were upheld. Lisa worked hard to prove she was changing. It wasn't easy, but over time, she earned the respect of the customers, including those she had once turned away. As for Thomas, he became a regular. Every time he walked in, he was greeted with a smile and a hot cup of coffee waiting at his favorite table. The small diner, once a reflection of the town's prejudices, became an example of how people, with effort and humility, can learn to see one another with fresh eyes. Thank you for reading to the end. If this story made you think, don't miss the next one I recommend here. It's another important look at understanding and changing racism. Click now, and let's keep talking about what matters.